Welcome to Beside Ourselves, a podcast on AI adoption for business by the Beside Partners.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Beside Ourselves. We are the Beside Partners. This is a podcast on AI and business adoption. As always, my partner in crime is on the call. Hi, Giles. How are you doing?
I'm not too bad, Theo. How are you?
Very well, very well. How do you like this partner in crime business? I mean,
As long as I don't have to wear my underpants on the outside of my trousers, I don't mind. It's fine.
Okay, cool. We'll keep it. It's easy keepers. We're kind of, have a Bonnie and Clyde show over here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, maybe go for more of that one. I'm thinking Batman and Robin, but yeah, let's.
That's another good one as well.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So talking of which, on this week's episode, we will be talking about how to lower the temperature a little bit on AI, especially in light of all the recent news stories, everything that is going on. There's a few news stories that have monopolized the interest in the media, especially in terms of AI, in the last 2 weeks. The first one being the announcement by Anthropic, how the capabilities of the Mythos preview and the fact that they managed to find exploits and vulnerabilities in a lot of software. And then there was Project Glasswing, where they shared the model with a number of cyber companies to prepare, if you like, the software for all that. But there is clearly a movement over there to take a step back a little bit and not kind of go all guns blazing and release a new model, but, a defensive move that so far we have not seen from the AI labs. And the other one, of course, was the attacks against Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, which obviously need to be condemned. There's no way to conduct a debate, of course, but they do point to the fact that discontent, a certain anxiety is real. Then there is evidence, on our side of the pond. There is some backlash here from the NHS, where people do not feel comfortable using software by Palantir and everything it is. It all contributes to a sense of unease about the technology, that maybe it's all moving too fast, that maybe, the debate, the conversation is all a little bit too heated. There's too much noise, and there's beyond the noise, actually. There's a bit too much heat in there. There's a lot of rhetoric about, oh my God, this is going to change everything. Everybody needs to adapt, and they need to adapt now. But then again, people are not quite ready for it, right? And it's leading to that sense of unease between people, and of course flows into companies. So that brings us to that question: how do we turn the heat down a little bit on the conversation about AI? How do we keep driving adoption? Because this is a great technology to use. How do we maintain momentum while at the same time kind of keeping that caution going, deploying it safely? Do you see that? Do you see that feeling, the kind of trend evolving as well?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I'd echo what you'd said. Obviously, some of the stuff that's being posted is over the top. And I think, while I do agree with Altman's sort of decry that, that we should, de-escalate, take the rhetoric out of it. I mean, some of this is very much of their own making. Some of the big players that exist in the AI space, spent years telling us about how it's the biggest threat to humanity and we need to do this the right way. And of course, now all of a sudden there's money on the table. It's like, oh yeah, nothing to see here. Don't worry. So you can't go from the one instant, flip from one instance to the other. You can't have your cake and eat it, so to speak. I think we all need to accept that there are concerns. We all need to accept that, this does have the potential to be transformational, in the way the Industrial Revolution was transformational, in the way the internet was transformational. This could be another turning point in, without getting grandiose, humanity in terms of what we do. And we need to therefore tread carefully. Maybe the difference this time is that, unlike maybe the internet and unlike the Industrial Revolution, we've had the Terminator films and we've had all the other movies that depict what the world could be like, which, although obviously their stories, does make people think, oh, actually, this sounds familiar. So, yeah, I think there is a need to, as you say, de-escalate it and have that conversation, and have a grown-up and adult conversation about it. the Sam Altmans and Anthropics and all these people, the Elon Musks of this world, they need to be honest about their interest, or, be upfront about their interest, particularly, SpaceX, which now obviously contains X, and by association Grok, and obviously OpenAI, they're all moving towards an IPO. So obviously they're trying to kind of get their stories straight to obviously generate revenue. It's all obviously underpinned by revenue. But likewise, you have governments to a greater or lesser extent, depending on which governments you are, but particularly on this side of the pond where you've got, the EU obviously very cautious about, we need to have regulation in there. And you've got the general public, of which, we'll include ourselves, but obviously small to medium enterprise owners, business people, our parents, our children, everybody is kind of cautious about, well, what does this mean? And the trying to rush, we've been spending the last few years just spitting out models, at a weekly cadence, and then that's reduced a bit now because obviously, as we've they've matured, but, it's always the rush on to the next thing. And actually there does need to be a kind of conversation around what does this mean for us and how can we, accepting that. But, so I think, yes, we need to lower the temperature. Yes, but lowering the temperature doesn't mean that we need to slow down as such. It just means we need to change the conversation. Let's change
the tone of
conversation,
right?
And let's have the conversation. And having these big companies just saying we don't need regulation, there's nothing. That's not the answer. Everybody needs to come together and agree a mechanism of working and stuff like that. To your point about the whole Anthropic working group, I mean, there's an example of, I guess you could take a slightly more grown-up approach to it, where obviously they've identified that the latest version of their models, the Mythos preview, has obviously, has significant capabilities in terms of information security. And actually, rather than just rushing to get that out there, because you could argue that would be that could be a money spinner. They're like, actually, no, we need to do this properly. Let's get people together. Let's work through this, form a coalition. Let's try and work through these together as a group, as a united group, and actually, use this response. Now, that is the responsible thing to do. Now, that's not to say OpenAI wouldn't have done exactly the same thing. I would hope they would have done. But, we should take that attitude, but, maybe we need to broaden the conversation just based upon the latest features and stuff.
Absolutely.
Anyway, what are your thoughts?
So broadening the conversation is so we can see a template forming here. There is I see the beginnings of a template of how to handle these things, and maybe future releases of model releases that get more and more powerful. I have long advocated that for the most powerful models, we need much more restriction. Personally, I would like to see bank level KYC restriction before somebody has got access to a really powerful model. There is conversation about that. That's just one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is to have previews, to have a model that will first go or be released to some companies that can prepare us better for it. And for now, we're talking about cybersecurity. Maybe later on, if there is a model that, for example, is very good at automating a particular task, and therefore it will have a direct impact on a particular sector of the economy, maybe can be released to the companies affected or to the workers affected, so that people can start using it. They can prioritize the augmentation against the automation, and essentially stagger the release in that way. You have got previews, you have got releases, and knowing how powerful these things are, you don't just blurt it out to the broad public. You stagger the release first of all to the parties that are more interested. So that's kind of like the broadness of the conversation. The other one is about the shrillness of the conversation, the kind of language that we use to describe it. For a while now, we have been subjected, I suppose, to that really, I don't want to say megalomaniac, I want to say kind of apocalyptic language about it. Even kind of this, the implications of AI are going to be so fundamental. That this is a technology that, beyond other technologies, it will go to a place where it can create its own technology. Everything else that you mentioned earlier, the internet, the printing press, television, mobiles, all these things were kind of like transformational technologies, but they did not create their own technology. They did not have autonomy. Human agency was not in question. AI opens that door, and therefore we need to be much more careful about it. Now, balance that against the need to kind of not sounding like you are on the soapbox every time you talk about the capabilities, right? So I can see a template coming in there, both in terms of broadening the conversation and bringing down the tone a little bit. And as you said on this one, that does not mean that we have to take our foot off the gas in terms of adoption. It does, however, mean that we have to change slightly the way that we talk about it. And perhaps that also is how we talk about it with, with our clients, with businesses, which brings us to that question, right? What should we advise our clients to do? What should we advise SMEs to do practically to lower the heat, as we say?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the advice we're already talking about, and we've talked about on previous podcasts, and we talk about our clients all the time, I think that still stands. I think, yes, you almost have to cancel out the noise. These conversations need to happen, but to a certain extent, these things need to be set by either government policy or they need to be set by, independent bodies. To a certain extent, they can't be set by the organizations. Of course, the recent thing we've talked about, there was the whole thing with the US Department of Defense, with Anthropic sort of drawing lines in the sand of what they're prepared to do, and they were booted out, and then OpenAI, were very quickly given a government contract, though then since have rolled back on that and gone, well, actually, maybe that isn't quite what we want. You can see individual organizations doing this, but I think generally there needs to be policy set at a high level, and again, we'll get around to your question, but interesting the point you talked about finance. I mean, I've just spent many years working in the life science sector, which is a highly regulated industry that is bringing drugs to market that can transform people's lives for good or for bad. And therefore
hopefully for good.
Yeah, hopefully for good, but there are significant risks in that. So therefore, to mitigate those risks, there are regulations in place. You have to turn up with evidence. You have to be able to convince a regulator that actually you've approached things in the right way, and all this sort of stuff. Now, that's not me saying that we need to go to that level with AI, but there is potentially, some elements of that, particularly if you're talking about tools that are just going to be released into the public domain, that maybe there needs to be a barrier to entry. It can't just be these companies running to their roadmaps, running to get features and functionality out to gain market share, to give themselves the best outcomes when it comes to an IPO. That's obviously, commercialism working there. And actually,
Nice.
These two things, are separate. Yes, these companies need to make money to be able to do what they do, but they need to be able to do it in the right way. Yeah, I'm not really sure what I'm saying there, but I'll get back to your original question. What does SMEs mean? I guess the point I was trying to make was those conversations need to happen, and they need to happen really. I think it needs to be at a government level, and it needs to happen within these organisations, between these organisations, and maybe some sort of consortium there.
I find it really, regulation obviously will play a big part. We have covered regulation before, and it is probably the most important area where we set the boundaries for this technology and how we deploy it, right? It's very interesting that you mentioned life sciences is the area that you are experienced in, so that regulated sector. I've got a background in fintech and financial services, another regulated sector.
Yeah.
What these sectors have in common, and what the regulatory frameworks, I think, in both sectors have in common, is something that AI industry is missing. And it would it's essential to this conversation about bringing the heat down, which is explainability.
Yes.
When you develop a drug, when you develop a financial product, you have to be able to trace back all these decisions. You have to record conversations with customers. You have to record, in your case, clinical trials and what have. So basically, by the time you end to a financial product reaching the market, or by the time you end up with a drug reaching the market, you have to be able to trace back the route that it came to, so that if there are adverse effects, you can point at them and just say, okay, something didn't work here. Let's either fix it or cancel it. AI doesn't have that. AI suffers from a fundamental lack of explainability. And another area where I think that we absolutely must put more focus in, from a practical perspective, is to pause on the features and pause on the strength of the power of the models and shift the focus a little bit towards explainability. Ethos, or the latest models and all that, all this power is fantastic, it's great, but it's nothing if we cannot explain how we ended up there. How, if we look at it and we're going to say, okay, because it can find vulnerabilities in software, if it hallucinates, if it creates problems in any way, but we don't know how we got there, almost inevitably, we're going to end up with that tone of voice of what's going on here, that panic that kind of seems to be driving this, this current sentiment that you have. So, yeah, I personally would say that explainability is something that practically I would love to see AI Labs do more of, to kind of help us both in terms of understand the technology and even trust it. I mean, if they're going to ask us to deploy autonomous agents, Jesus, we need agents. Any kind of autonomy needs to come with explainability, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So before we talk about that, I think it's an important element of getting the conversation to a normal level. It's going to be explainability, to make it a little bit more like a normal technology that it is.
Well, that's it. And just to kind of go a step further with that, I think that the difference here than maybe, or definitely in life sciences, maybe less so in fintech, is that a lot of this technology, there are technologies that are built on top of these technologies. So if you've already got, shaky foundations, for want of a better phrase, then you've got all these other products and services that exist that sit above them that are reliant on it. And there's this kind of cascade effect that, actually, well, how do you regulate the tools that use the models? Because you could, and again, just playing devil's advocate, I guess what the AI companies would say, well, if you kind of lock us in handcuffs and make us jump through so many hoops, you're restricting our ability to make business decisions and rapid business decisions, whereas there are businesses that are then leveraging our capabilities that are also able to crack on and do what they want to do and stuff like that. But I guess, the flip side of that is to say, but that's the nature of what you're doing. If you're providing a whole platform, it's a similar argument that's been going on with the whole Apple App Store ecosystem, and that it's like,
exactly.
Well, when you first come to it, it's innovative and it's new and therefore it's fine. But once that becomes a complete ecosystem of one which other people, therefore, the rules change, and obviously in that instance they're trying to release some of the restrictions, but maybe the argument, and this is actually, well, we need to maybe put more restrictions in. They still make good money because they're taking revenue from all those tools, but they need to understand the impacts of what they do.
And it is a transition from these companies kind of seeing themselves as labs. They call themselves AI labs, to being AI software vendors.
Yes.
Because if you're a lab, of course, experimentation and speed of development and even lack of regulation, kind of like freedom to experiment, is important. But their business models no longer, I showcase them as labs. They are now software vendors.
Yeah.
And therefore, putting boundaries around what the systems can do and how they deploy them, how they implement them, how they integrate them within the context of an organization is much more important than developing much more power. Explainability comes into it, and integration as well. But it seems to be the biggest disconnect over here that I can see in terms of kind of the original question about, this feeling of discontent and anxiety that's being created from, the level of conversation, is that AI products now still try to achieve lab level results, speed and momentum, agility, and power, and exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas by now they have, they're being diffused around the economy, and the users of the software actually want more control. They want less power, less uncertainty, more control, whether it is guardrails, whether it is boundaries, whether it is kind of an agreement on how it is being regulated and how we use it, right?
Yeah. And I think the interesting analogy I would give is that they are to us now what Microsoft was back in the 80s and 90s of Windows. They are the operating system. These tools are the new operating systems upon which everything else is built. Now the difference is that in addition to being an operating system, they're also a kind of application in their own right. So, they have the chat GPT, which runs on OpenAI. Obviously, you have Claude that runs on the Anthropic models. So they've kind of got this, they've got foot in both camps. And I guess maybe there needs to come a point where they're going to have to make a choice saying, are you an operating system provider, or are you now actually, I've just kind of kicked myself with the Microsoft analogy. You had Office Office that ran on Windows, but of course they were two completely separate teams. And actually maybe that's the way you need to think about it. Think there's the Windows team, there's the Office team. Well, there's the OpenAI team, and there's the Chat GPT team, which I'm sure they are like that, but actually almost, treat them as two separate entities.
Absolutely.
And with the models, there is far more responsibility that comes with that, which, anyway, it just, I don't know.
Absolutely. But the relationship, just before we close down, though, the relationship between AI and software in that way, and especially going back to that Anthropic story about how the new Mythos preview model is able to find vulnerabilities, something like 70% of situations, or that the other crazy statistic that they uncovered a vulnerability that was 27 years old,
26, 27 years ago. Yeah, ridiculous.
It's just been learning around.
27 years. I've got it written down here. 27 years old, OpenBSD bug that was found that we'd all missed. We as in humans had all missed for all that time.
Well, at some point you stop looking, right? It's kind of like if it does a job, you stop looking. Who's going to look there?
I'm quite impressed. This software that's still running is 27 years old, to be quite
frank. Absolutely. But they did manage to find it, and it was an impressive statistic. There are lessons here for CIOs, CTOs, right? This is not going to go away. This actually has got a big impact on a company's tech stack, right?
Yeah, definitely. And it's actually interesting. I'm going through a process at the moment with a company where we're looking at a new platform, and we're looking about how we harden that and do all that sort of stuff. Now, obviously, the traditional way you do that is through best practice in terms of software development, in terms of information architecture, your infrastructure architecture, in terms of making sure you've got a secure and hardened environment that you're deploying on, you're following best practice in terms of the software, and obviously ultimately you're then testing that, be that yourselves, but also independently using third-party penetration testers and stuff like that. So I think, none of that changes, that still exists. And I think that the reality is that, these platforms, these models that are coming out, it's not going to suddenly mean that every single IT system is going to be completely open, like every firewall's dropped and stuff like that. If you've got as long as you've got the right defenses in place, you've still got those defenses. I think where the interesting, and there's almost an opportunity, and thinking as a fractional CTO and, have teams developing software and stuff, it does actually put more power in our fingertips as engineering teams to be able to test our environments ourselves and not rely so much on third-party pen testers. I think there is still the need, and there will always still be the need for independent testing, because, you can't mark your own homework. But actually, as a CTO, CIO, there's a potential there to give me more confidence that actually we could integrate more of that kind of security testing that we were historically doing externally into our actual development processes. And these tools will actually allow us to do that. So I think rather than being a threat, it's something we need to be aware of, because I see it as also being a potential opportunity as well. I don't know what you think.
Absolutely agree. And in fact, in many ways, I found that to be the most interesting thing behind the statistics of this entire announcement. The AISIs in the UK tests, for safety in AI, a remarkable organization, I think, in the European level. They released a study where they confirmed the capabilities of Mythos Preview. They also said that, look, testing environments are not realistic environments. There is no evidence that there is some kind of cyber apocalypse around the corner. Yes, you should be worried, but not panicked.
Yeah.
And they also did say that it is, through their tests, that a well-designed environment for security should be able to withstand any attacks even from these models. But again, like you said, probably for me, the most interesting part was the way that they conducted the tests, the red team operations, the capture the flag operations, basically the way that you design it, and the fact that it opens up a capability even for SMEs, perhaps consulting and experienced CIO, CTO, like the two of us, like the Beside partners, to actually run these experiments and just say, do I have vulnerabilities? Do I have libraries or frameworks that have not nobody thought of testing for 27 years and everything, right? And it's kind of like this becomes part of your playbook. And that is actually something that, again, both of us would choose to see as an opportunity, and it can be a very good thing, despite, of course, the obvious implications.
Yeah, and just one quick thought to add to that. I guess one positive outcome of this would be that actually it may put information security onto front of mind to people that maybe historically wouldn't have done in the past. Maybe they are running a bit loosey-goosey, for want of a better phrase. They are running open source solutions and stuff like that. So, there's the plus side could be that actually this sort of thing may actually make them stop and think, oh, actually, as you say, we've never tested that. Maybe we should test that. So, actually that could be a positive thing for SMEs as well. But anyway, I realise totally. we're getting on a bit in time.
We are getting in time, but the conversation is great. At some point, we're going to add the subject of AI's impact on cybersecurity onto our expanding list of things we should talk about. We're going to leave for another episode, absolutely.
We never get to that list because something new always appears in the intervening time, doesn't it?
For sure. Yeah. But for now, let's just kind of wrap up as always, just to ask you, what is your one takeaway from this week's topic?
Well, God, I mean, I think it's just probably the question I didn't answer, which was actually from an SME perspective, actually would be, we've talked really a lot about regulation. We've talked about the big AI companies and all that sort of stuff. I think for our audience, I guess the people who mainly listen to this, I'm pretty sure Sam Altman doesn't listen to this, but if he does, hi Sam.
Hey Sam.
But for them, what does it mean? I think it is something we need to be aware of. Information security should be at the forefront of all companies' minds. And actually, but actually see this as a positive. These tools give you an opportunity to do that, and potentially give you an opportunity to do that cost effectively. And obviously, if at the risk of sounding like an advert, as you said, if you don't have the capabilities yourself, then there are people out there who have the capabilities to help you with that. Exactly. Like ourselves, there's plenty of other people out there, specialists who can help you on that. So, just recheck, make sure everything's right. But if you're following best practice, you should be fine. And I really hope that's not famous last words.
Absolutely. Well, I'll go with the final thought that this is another empowering conversation for SME leadership. So you have the power, if you are a CEO, a COO, a CTO in a small company, to set the tone of conversation, both from prioritizing cyber stuff that we just talked about, but also the way that you bring about change. You can bring more people into the conversation, so broaden it, but also tone down or flatten down the conversation a little bit. Adopting AI doesn't have to be an all-out transformation. Let's change everything. Not on day one. I mean, eventually it might happen because you're operating in your competitive environment will evolve to that line, but it doesn't have to be this all-encompassing project that you have to embark right away, and therefore that's how you drop the tones. And good so stuff. With that, we're getting to the end of today's episode. As always, we were beside ourselves to have everyone here. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Do remember to send us your question on the comments or via email, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks' time. For now, bye-bye.
Cheers, guys. Thanks, Sarah. See you soon.
Thank you for listening to Beside Ourselves. Don't forget to send us your questions via the comments or the email address in the description.